Hello, I'm Karen Kornbluh, Distinguished Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to another edition of Transatlantic AI Conversations, where we attempt to demystify how the public can enjoy the fruits of the new technology and detail how it can be implemented and harnessed for public good. I'm going to turn over the mic to Chris Schroeder, my co-conspirator on this series. He's an author, entrepreneur, investor, and also the board chair here at GMF. And he'll start the conversation with our guest. We're so delighted to have today Chris Miller.
Thanks so much, Karen. This is such an awesome series. I'm very happy to be supportive of it in any way that I can. And I couldn't be more excited to have this conversation with Chris. Everyone knows, I think at this point, he's associate professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, but of course the author of Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Chris is also part of the GMF family, historically having completed a fellowship as our Transatlantic Academy back in 2015. So Chris, welcome back, and thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Chris, just quickly on the breaking news side of it, before we get into some of the depth, how do you think we're going to be talking in a few days about this terrible, terrible earthquake in Taiwan? Is this having a major impact, or is this something that we're in a pretty good place on?
Well, I think the early signs are that it hasn't been too damaging, given the scale of the earthquake. Anything this large is going to have some impact, but I think the chip industry in Taiwan has been preparing for something just like this. They've survived earthquakes of this magnitude before with pretty limited disruption. And so I think the industry is hoping, and I think it probably will end up being only minorly disrupted by this earthquake.
It's just fascinating. Obviously, our hearts go out to the people who have suffered in this and all. So thank you for also that update overall. Look, one of the things that I'm hearing all the time now, I mean, the conversation about chips has been exactly as you've outlined it in the book going forward and all. And then in the world of AI, a lot of the conversation is shifting, I think, a little bit from software to hardware right now. OpenAI and others are discussing themselves that they've got big plans to get into the chip worlds overall. Can you give us just a little bit of a tour of where are we in chips now? What is really mattering? And what are some of the greatest limitations as we really are unleashing what's happening in AI?
Well, I think when a lot of people think about AI, they think about algorithms or think about data, but actually the key driver of advances in AI has been better and cheaper computing power. And that's been provided by better and more capable chips. And what you find when you talk to AI companies is that their biggest limitation right now is access to computing power. There's still a shortage of the types of chips that are needed for both training and deploying big AI systems. And that's why companies like NVIDIA have become household names by their ability to produce these ultra high powered chips that are perfectly tuned for training AI systems. And this, I think, has helped acclimatize more people to the extent to which our advances in technology aren't just about software. They're not just about internet applications. They're also about the hardware that makes all of this possible.
I think in that light, we're hearing similar discussions coming out of China, and you talk obviously fair amount in your book about the China ramifications going forward, but a lot has happened in the last 18 months overall. How should we be thinking about the state of play vis-a-vis China, both on the software and AI side, but also specifically now in chips and the environment you've just described?
I think what you find is that the Chinese government is investing very, very heavily in semiconductors, tens of billions of dollars a year of government funds going into China's chip industry. And the reason is that today China is still pretty far behind, both in terms of where its technology is and also in terms of the capacity. Today, China spends as much money each year importing chips as it spends importing oil. There's no product on which China is more dependent on the outside world. And if you look at the countries that China buys chips from, it's Japan, it's the United States, it's South Korea, and above all, it's Taiwan. And so you can understand why China's leaders think that relying on geopolitical competitors for their most critical technology is something that they're unwilling to tolerate. And so they've been driving hard, trying to catch up to Taiwan, catch up to the United States when it comes to advanced chip technology. And I think understandably, the US and Taiwan want to keep their edge, which is relevant both for commercial applications, but also for other metrics of national power. And so that's why the chip issue has become really a front and center question for US-China relations today.
Sometimes when I talk to policymakers and regulators, both here and in Europe, they take, I think, some comfort in China being, quote unquote, very far behind. Should they be taking comfort in that? And do you feel that Europe and America is doing what it should be doing in terms of making sure they keep that pace and moving ahead, or are they having something catching up right over their shoulders?
Well, I think there's an impressive amount of innovation that happens within China. The number of engineers that have worked internationally is very large. The amount of capital investment going in the industry is substantial. So it'd be really wrong, I think, to underestimate China. And they've made meaningful strides over the past, not just several years, but decade to build up their chip industry. What's kept them behind thus far is that as they've been improving their technology, the United States, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Europe, they've also been improving their technology. And so the gap has narrowed somewhat, but there still is a bit of a gap between where the West is and where China is. But I think the fact that that gap's persistence requires us to be racing ahead as rapidly as we can means that we can't take it for granted. We've got to make sure that our companies and also governments are aligned on the goal of developing this technology as rapidly as possible.
On the private sector side of friends of mine, both in America and Silicon Valley and Europe, they sometimes think they're actually running in this race with ankle weights. Is there any message that you'd like to give to regulators here and our friends in Europe that sort of says these are things you really need to be thinking about perhaps differently than you are right now in that way?
Well, I think when governments think about tech companies and think about AI, they often think first about regulation, which is understandable in some ways. Regulation is one of the things that governments do, so it's not a surprise that they think about it. But I guess when I look at tech policy in general, I think regulation is obviously going to be part of the story, but I think we probably want to measure our tech ecosystems first and foremost by the rate of innovation. Are they delivering capabilities and products that we didn't have before? And then we can think about how do we want to actually regulate whatever advances come. But if you don't have advances, you have nothing for even the regulators to do. And so I do worry at times that our discussions, both in the US, but I think perhaps especially in Europe, focus a bit too much on how to regulate advances and not enough on how to make advances actually happen.
So it's interesting. I mean, a part of the almost hedging element that is an element of overall, there's been obviously an enormous market reliance on Taiwan for this globally, we as much as China or anywhere else. And so there's been discussion about doing what we can to leverage to be more competitive other opportunities. I'm hearing mixed things about the plan B to Taiwan in terms of how it's happening in America. I've heard better things Japan. Can you just give us a tour of how sort of plan B is going as an additional alternative so we're not talking a few years from now about 90+% reliance on Taiwan?
I would say first off that the reason we're also reliant on Taiwan is that the leading Taiwanese firms have extraordinary economies of scale that drive down their production costs and also make their technology easier to develop, because the more chips you produce, the more you learn, the more you hone your production processes. And there are some really deep structural factors that therefore make Taiwan a pretty efficient place to produce high-end chips. So there's a really difficult, I think, starting point that the U.S., that Europe, and that Japan are starting at when it comes to trying to diversify the chip supply chain, just because they're not going to have those economies of scale at the outset. And that's why governments in each of those three geographies have had to spend tens of billions of dollars in an effort to just begin the diversification process. It's really a very expensive prospect. And I think, as you say, it's going to be a partial success at best. Recently, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, said that her aim was to have 20% of AI chips produced in the U.S. by 2030, which implies that perhaps 80% will be produced in Taiwan. And that's less than 90% today, but it's a change that I think is modest and recognizes the fact that there are a lot of efficiencies that come from Taiwan's economies of scale.
What I find so interesting about the 2030 statement overall is already from now, even when you wrote your book, technology on chips is just changing so rapidly. There's so many startups that are trying to do things. So I'm not even sure exactly what we're saying when we say the denominator is 2030. And as you know, I mean, there are companies like Etched AI and a bunch of others right now that are taking highly customized chip focus in their strategy in order to have massive efficiencies and really form a new kind of way of even thinking about chips. What tech innovation of that order of magnitude is intriguing you most? And will we be talking about in 2028, let alone 2030, as we sort of have this kind of almost backward-looking way of going from 90% to 80%?
I think that is exactly the right question. Because of our reliance on Taiwan and the risk that China poses to Taiwan, we have needed to spend some pretty substantial funds diversifying our supply chains. But in the long run, the key question is going to be, can we out-innovate China? And there, it's going to be probably new technologies that will determine that, rather than just racing forward along existing paradigms. And so I think you're right to point to new chip architectures that are being deployed. We should expect a whole lot of new efficiencies in how we train models and certainly how we deploy AI models at large scale. And these will probably be just as important as the question of where individual chips are made. It doesn't mean that this question of resilient supply chains isn't important. It certainly is important, especially if something goes wrong in the Taiwan Straits. But we shouldn't, and I don't think we are, but we shouldn't fixate solely on this and forget that actually we need to keep innovating every year to stay ahead in this competition.
Initially, I was going to ask you if you grade how the Chips and Science Act has been a year or so into it. In some respects, I'm curious to your grade, but I also want to know what learning there is. Now that we're sort of a year into it, or a little bit more, what are some of the takeaways that you have that we should be listening to and learning from as future regulation may come in all of this?
Well, I think the first learning is just how hard it is to begin to influence supply chain decisions when the existing structure of the supply chain rests on some pretty strong economic logic. We're pushing against an industry that is optimized over around efficiency for now many decades. And so we're demanding that industry take some steps that feel pretty inefficient at the outset. And so companies have to set up new supply chains, new chemicals providers, new materials suppliers as they begin to bring online production in new geographies. And that's a complex and at times even a painful process for companies to get through. So I think the key lesson is that we shouldn't have let ourselves get in a situation where we were so reliant on just one supplier at the outset. And I think as we look forward with both our analyses of the tech sector in general, but also our relationship with China as well, we need to think about proactive steps to make sure that we don't become as reliant as we are in this case on a single company.
I'm going to pass it to Karen in a second, but just last question along those lines, because your book was a wonderful articulation of that very piece of learning even then. I'm sort of curious with all the changes that have happened so rapidly, particularly technologically, would your book be different now if it was actually being written and published right now?
Well, I published Chip War just a couple of weeks before ChatGPT was released, and so since then there's been, of course, a surge in investment in AI, and companies like NVIDIA have made the headlines on an almost weekly basis. So whenever I do sit down to write the epilogue for the paperback version, there'll be a whole lot more AI in it than was in the first version.
So interesting, Karen.
Great. I want to start by just following up on Chris's question about the Chips and Science Act, and do you feel that it was enough? And how do we make sure that we're encouraging the industry to go where the puck is going to be, rather than where the puck is? When you're talking about the government and creating this kind of ecosystem. And I guess I have that question about the U.S. and then I want to turn with a more specific question to Europe as well.
Well, on Chips and Science, I would say that I think the act was reasonable as a first iteration. But if you want to impact manufacturing supply chains in the long run, you can't just pass one act. The reality is that if you want to build a chip making facility in China, you get substantially more subsidies than you get in the United States, even with the CHIPS Act. And so we've got to think about how do we make our manufacturing operations as competitive as they can be over the long run. And I think that means making sure that tax credits for chip making facilities get extended so that companies can keep investing in the facilities that they're building year after year in a way that is cost competitive with China and other countries. And that's probably going to require Congress to step up and say, we need to keep acting here, or else we're going to find ourselves in the same position as when we started, whereby you can actually get more subsidy dollars from the Chinese government than you can from nearly any other government on the planet. So I think that's part of the solution. But the other part is to go back and think about skating to where the puck is headed. And that's not just a question of where you have factories. It's a question of what type of technology are you producing in them. And here the U.S. government has actually, I think, a pretty good track record via institutions like DARPA of funding some of the prototypes that will eventually become really important technologies. And the key distinction that I would make is that I think the U.S. government has done a really good job of helping turn new ideas into a first product and then handing it off to the private sector to turn it into a product that ends up in all of our pockets. And so that government to private sector handoff, I think, is really critical to focus on.
And that brings me to Europe. Europe in general is not playing as large a role as they'd like to play. And I'm wondering what thoughts you have about that ecosystem and how they can build that. I mean, one of the things that we've heard is it's less the regulatory overhang than it is just the capital, access to capital, and the risk taking. I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of specifically the chip industry.
I think part of the challenge that Europe faces is that although there's a single market, it still is in some ways many different fragmented markets. And so if you're looking to scale a product, in a lot of ways, the US is still the best place in the world to scale over a much larger customer base. But I do think you're right that capital markets matter a whole lot. And the US has just a much deeper venture capital ecosystem, and in particular in the semiconductor space, although there's, even in the US, much more venture capital money goes to software than to semiconductors. The US does have a larger pool of experienced investors with substantial resources who can bet big on semiconductor startups. And the key in the semiconductor space is that you need longer time horizons and you need more capital to get a company off the ground than you do in the software space. And so the size of your VC ecosystem really does matter.
That's great. Thank you. And I want to turn to export controls. The U.S. Obviously tried to limit China and Russia's access to the tools to make AI chips. And I'm wondering what you think about some of the leakage that's been occurring through third countries and what the Biden administration might do in order to limit that leakage.
Well, I think that any export control or sanction regime is going to have leakage. That's inevitable. The question is the scale of leakage enough to undermine the point of the control? And if you look at the control on the sale of AI chips to China, the question is, are Chinese AI firms more constrained when it comes to accessing high-end compute than they otherwise would be? And if so, is this a significant amount of constraint? And I think it's still early days, but my sense is that the answer is probably yes. That there are constraints that Chinese firms are facing. Anecdotally, you do hear a bit of that. And certainly you can look at public statements of Chinese tech company founders who have, for example, publicly bragged about how many NVIDIA chips they've stockpiled from before the controls were put in place. Well, you'd only brag about your ability to stockpile if it was hard to access new chips. And so I think that's another reason to think that there are some compute challenges that Chinese firms are facing. Is that alone going to determine who wins the AI competition? No, certainly not. The key variable is how fast can you run. But is it harder to run fast if you've got a bit less access to compute? I think that's a reasonable assumption to make.
And what about the overcapacity? I saw that you'd written about the fact that China may be flooding the market in order to create overcapacity and maybe discourage some Western firms from getting into the market because it'll hurt their profits.
Well, I think this is already a real issue. You can already look at newspaper headlines to find examples of chip companies that are cutting prices in the face of Chinese competition or even deciding not to invest because they think new investments might not be profitable given the competition coming from China. And it's key to note, this is not market competition. This is not a level playing field. This is China subsidizing its chip industry, something around the scale of the rest of the world's chip subsidies combined.
Wow.
It's the US CHIPS Act plus the EU CHIPS Act plus Japan plus more on top of that. That's the scale. And so I think, many of my economist friends will say, well, this is free trade at work. And I think the moment you start looking into the scale of subsidies, you realize that is far from the status quo. And so it is inducing policymakers in the US and Europe and Japan to ask, what are the remedies that you can turn to defend your industries in the face of this type of competition?
Great. Thank you. And I want to ask you about biotech as well, AI and biotech, and what you expect that the new chips that are allowing us to really create a whole new revolution in biology, what you're expecting, what you're seeing in that space.
Well, I think that the application of AI to biotechnology is one of the most exciting spaces. We've already seen it with AlphaFold several years ago, and I think that's just going to be the first of a series of really extraordinary techniques that will let us accelerate the pace of experimentation and therefore accelerate the pace of drug discovery and other advances. I think if you look even further down the road, one of the really interesting trends is the use of chips as sensors, for example, to help better detect changes in biological systems, whether in human health or agriculture. There's lots of fascinating research being done right now on ways to use very small but very capable chips to understand how biological environments are changing. And so I think if we look 20 years down the line, that's actually a really fascinating new frontier.
That's great. Thank you. This is so interesting. I think it's interesting even to people who are not nerds like me, who've been fascinated by chips since I don't know if I told you this, I wrote my master's thesis on the chip industry. It was called "When the Chips Are Down."
Very clever.
I'm sure Chris has heard that one before. Anyway, to wrap up, we ask all our interviewees, what are the one or two pieces of content that you recommend they explore after watching this and getting fascinated by the industry? It can be an article, a book, a podcast, anything to help people keep digging in on this. And of course, we will put a link to purchase your book as one of those pieces of content. But what else would you recommend?
Well, I think in trying to understand technology, everyone always assumes that we're seeing things that are new. And I always like to look at the history of technology to understand how technology might actually develop. And so I think there are just fascinating books written on tech history. One of my favorites is a book called Nexus, which looks at the emergence of telegraph cables and their intersection with geopolitics in the late 19th century. And so I think that's both a fascinating story, but also a really useful way of thinking about what are the geopolitical implications of not just AI, but also the networks of data centers that are needed to train and deploy AI systems. So I would commend that to all of your listeners as a great historical take on how to think about technology today.
Great. Thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you again for having me.